Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. Today I'm here with Dr. Wes Morriston, who is an excellent philosopher, and I'm very excited for this conversation because we were talking about William Lane Craig's successive addition argument for the finitude of the past. This has to do with the Kalam cosmological argument and specifically that second premise, the second premise that says the universe began to exist. So that's really what we're concerned with. We're talking in particular about Wes's paper, Infinity, Time, and Successive Addition in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy. Very excellent paper. You guys can check the links in the description to different papers and videos that I've done on the Kalam and that Wes and Alex Malpass have done as well. So without further ado, Wes, thank you so much for coming on. I'm really excited for this.
Okay, so we want to talk about the successive addition argument, as I'm calling it. It's a very old argument. One thinks, first of all, I suppose, of Immanuel Kant and the first antinomy. But this argument has been around much longer even than that. The crucial idea is that an infinite series can't be formed by successive addition. And the whole paper is really about that claim. Is it true that an infinite series cannot be formed by successive addition? Now, what does this have to do with the Kalam cosmological argument? Well, if a series can't be formed by successive addition, then you might think a beginningless series cannot be formed by successive addition. And if the world had no beginning, it would be infinitely old. And so this would tell us that it can't be true that the world has no beginning. So, William Lane Craig, amongst others, has pushed this argument pretty hard. And it's an argument that a number of people continue to defend. The paper isn't only about Craig, it's about what a number of people have had to say about the successive addition argument, or the argument against the traversal of the infinite, it's sometimes called. So the critical question, as I see it, is really, is it true that no infinite series can be formed by successive addition? Well, what is it to be formed by successive addition? It's really a pretty simple idea, it would seem. One thing happens after another. I mean, that's really all there is to it. So I'm going to form a series right now by successive addition. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I just formed a 5-member series by successive addition. Okay, so that's all there is to that idea. Now, is it the case that an infinite series cannot be formed by successive addition? Well, people often defend this premise by starting out something like this. Well, suppose, Wes, that you didn't just want to form a 5-member series by successive addition, but you wanted to form an infinite many member series by successive addition. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And the point is that no matter how many times I add 1, I will never arrive at infinity. I will never have put up infinitely many fingers. Or if I were collecting coins, say, and it were my ambition to collect infinitely many coins, it's not the case that I will ever arrive at a situation in which I have a collection and the number of coins in that collection is infinitely many coins. Or if I wanted to, my sole ambition were to have taken infinitely many steps. So I start out walking 1, 2, 3, 4 steps. Well, I'll never arrive at a time at which I have taken more than finitely many steps. Now, this seems perfectly straightforward and obvious. So it's very tempting to conclude from this that therefore an infinite series that has no beginning is impossible. Why? Well, if it had no beginning, right? It would have infinitely many steps. Infinitely many steps would have been taken. But we just saw that you can never arrive at a time at which infinitely many steps have been taken. So what's wrong with just quickly concluding that a beginningless series is impossible? A series of steps formed by successive addition is impossible. What's wrong with just quickly drawing that conclusion? Well, here's the problem. If I start out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I have started out. And the series under discussion is a series that has a beginning. And there really is, there really is no place for it to end if my plan is always to add 1. On the other hand, if the series that is beginningless has an end, right, but no beginning. So there's a sharp disanalogy, as it were, between the two cases. Now, it looks as if what we're dealing with then is just a non sequitur. I mean, saying, well, you can't start out and get to infinity, therefore you cannot have added in infinitely many steps. And when I say you can't have, I don't mean I can't have. I mean, there just cannot have been, right? Suppose there were an infinite relay team of counters, right? And each one is assigned the task of counting 10 units. Well, let's say that infinitely many numbers, negative numbers, say, counting down, minus 4, minus 3, minus 2, minus 1, 0. Let's say that infinitely many have been counted, but each counter has counted only 10. Well, there was no first counter because, right, in each 10-member sequence, the first counter took over from, right, the last counter in the previous relay team. So here we have an infinite series of relay teams of counters. And it looks as if we've gotten all the way through all of the negative numbers. Each one of them has begun with some one of the negative numbers and is counted off 10. So what's the problem? I mean, it doesn't follow from the fact that starting out with the number 1, I can't count all the way to Aleph naught, that it cannot, that the scenario that I just described is impossible. So that's the problem at the outset. Now, if you really like the successive addition argument, there are really just 2 ways to proceed, it seems to me, 2 main ways to proceed. One way is to say, well, I can give you an argument that bridges this gap. I can give you an argument that says, if you can't count off infinitely many, if you can't have a series that has infinitely many members, by starting with one of them and continuing without stopping, right, then it's impossible to do it the other way around. It's impossible for it to have been done the other way around, ending with the final element of a beginningless series. So one sort of argument would be say, okay, I'm going to take you on that. I'm going to show you that this is not, right, that there is a bridging principle here, that we can get from the one, right, impossibility to the other. The other way to go is just to consider the 2 cases independently. Everyone will agree that starting out with one of them, you can never arrive at a point at which infinitely many have been counted, right? And so we're just going to consider the beginningless case in its own right. We're just going to look at its properties, and we're going to show that a beginningless series formed by successive addition is impossible. I think that's really hard to do, but that certainly is what Craig tries to do. And so I consider both of those in the paper, as well as some other spin-off spin-off arguments that
Yeah.
we'll get to.
Yeah. Yeah, we're definitely going to get to those. But for the audience, that was an excellent overview of like the first section of your paper. That was wonderful. So for the audience, we're focusing on an argument for the finitude of the past, essentially, right? So the argument goes something like, right, if the past were beginningless, well, then there would have been a beginningless series of distinct events, one after another, and distinct discrete events. But such a series is formed by successive addition, right? As time passes, you're kind of adding fresh events successively, one after another. And so you have an infinite series formed by successive addition if the past were beginningless. But, so the argument goes, you cannot have such a series. There cannot be such a series formed by successive addition, an infinite series formed by successive addition, that is. Hence, the past is not beginningless. The past cannot be beginningless. The past had a beginning. And so that's the kind of argument. And then, as you pointed out, there are various defenses of that kind of crucial premise that you cannot form an infinite series by successive addition. And oftentimes they're kind of pointing to these kinds of thought experiments or examples, as you said, right? So they'll be like, oh, well, if you start at 1 and 1, 2, 3, you're never going to get to infinity, right? And you know, you'll start, you gave the example of the coin as well. So that's how they try to defend that premise, that you can't, if you can't count to infinity, for instance, how could you count down from infinity? That's what Craig likes to ask as well. So we have this defense of the premises, and then you come along and your point is that, well, hold on a second, right? All these examples that are trying to, you know, illustrate or, you know, tease out the impossibility of forming an actual infinite series by successive addition, all of those are pretty, it's like a biased sample, as you put it in the paper. They all have a first member, and then your task, as it were, or the person in the scenario, their task is to go from that first member and then successively form somehow a series which is such that it becomes infinite. It kind of traverses that gap from finitude to infinitude. And so your point is like, okay, yeah, even if we conceded that that kind of series cannot be formed by successive addition, it doesn't follow that a one without a beginning, right? A series without a beginning cannot be formed by successive addition. And then in your paper, you're going through different ways that they can kind of circumvent this problem. So they might say, if that kind of series with a beginning is impossible, the infinite series formed by successive addition, starting with some point, if that's impossible, well, then a beginningless one would likewise be impossible. You consider that route. And then the second route you consider is just looking at the two cases independently. So I wanted to orient the audience. I wanted to summarize what you had, just so the audience kind of understands the dialectic. And I guess we can probably move on now to the next. Well, I guess we could probably either look, it's up to you. We could look at the sense in which an endless future is formed by, is an infinite series formed by successive addition. Yeah, how about we do that? And then after that, we'll go on to examining the two different approaches that you were saying. The first one where it tries to do that inference to bridge the gap, and then the second one where you consider the cases independently. So how about we go on to the sense in which an endless future is formed by successive addition?
Well, yeah, that's really pretty straightforward. If all successive addition is right, if all a series formed by successive addition is, well, it's a series in which one event follows another, right? If that's the whole definition of formed by successive addition, then I say an endless series of future events is a series formed, is an infinite series. Infinite because there's no final member, right? For each one, there is another, there is a successor. So they can put in one-to-one, can be put in one-to-one correlation with natural numbers. And if you ask how many of them will there be, how many, the answer is infinitely many. The first cardinal infinity, that's the only possible answer in my opinion. Alex Malpass and I have defended this position at some length. So I won't go on and on about it now, but so it's infinite, it's formed by successive addition. So what on earth is the problem? Of course, a series, an infinite series can be formed by successive addition, right? Now, I think that there's an obvious answer to this. And the answer is, well, there will be no time at which all of, the whole series has been formed by successive addition. So something extra is now being built into the concept of formed by successive addition. And the extra something is that the series has been completed. That's the extra something, right? If all you say is, well, one happens after another, and the answer to the question, how many of them, is infinitely many, then an endless series of future events is absolutely formed by successive addition. I don't see any way around that, but I understand that a lot of people don't agree, but I'm prepared to talk about that if I need to.
Yeah.
But in the context of this argument, I suppose that the advocates of the successive addition argument are going to make the move that I just described. They're going to say, well, we're going to build something extra into the concept of formed by successive addition. We're going to say that what we really mean is that an infinite series cannot be completed by successive addition. And so it's with that understanding that I consider, the arguments that take up the rest of the paper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I'm glad we covered that, because that allows me to, plug the stuff in the description as well. So I'll put your discussion with Landon Hedrick and Alex Malpass in the discussion. It's probably my favorite YouTube video of like all time. I love that discussion. It was so great. So everyone check that out, as well as a bunch of different papers in there on the endless future objection. But we can probably set that aside because, you guys have covered that, and I've also covered it in other videos. So now we can move on to that first way that defenders of the successive addition argument trying to get around the objection that you're posing. And so to remind the audience, right, the objection that you're posing is that, hey guys, listen, the thought experiments that you guys offer to prove the impossibility of forming an actual infinite series by successive addition, those all involve a series having a first member, but the conclusion that you're inviting us to draw is that no infinite series whatsoever, even if it doesn't have a first member, cannot be formed by successive addition. And you're pointing out that this is either a really hasty generalization or a non sequitur. And so now let's move on to that first way that defenders of the successive addition argument try to respond to this. And they're trying to say, hey, well, if a series, which you admit, if a series having a first member cannot be formed, an infinite series, that is, cannot be formed by successive addition, if it has a first member, well, then it simply follows that all infinite series whatsoever cannot be formed by successive addition, regardless of whether or not they have a first member. So let's move on to consider that response, and let's consider the argument from symmetry. So this is the third section in your paper. So can you kind of, what's the general idea behind this argument from symmetry?
I guess at the most general level, and putting it in the least technical possible way, the idea is that the natural numbers are completely symmetrical with the negative numbers. So if you take the order type of the natural numbers and the order type of the negative numbers, you have perfect symmetry. We know that we can't have a series that corresponds with the natural numbers, right, completed by successive addition going forward, right? You can't go 1, 2, 3, 4 and arrive at infinity, because infinity isn't the successor of any natural number. Any natural number plus 1 is another natural number, right? Well, but the argument is, it's really very simple. The order type of the negative numbers is just the reverse of the order type of the natural numbers. There's a perfect symmetry between the two. So if you can't have a series of the order type of the natural numbers, right, formed by successive addition, you can't have a series of the order type of the negative numbers formed by successive addition, completed by successive addition either. But the order type of the negative numbers just is the order type of a beginningless past, a beginningless series of past events. So, right, conclusion, you can't have a beginningless series of past events. Does that seem like a fair summary? This argument was not advocated by, but formulated by Stephen Puryear in an excellent article in AJP some years back. Puryear has a completely different set of worries about the successive addition argument, which I think are very interesting and well worth thinking about. But this formulation is due to him. Okay, so what do I think about this? Well, imagine I'm too lazy to invent new examples. So, let's imagine another counter, somebody who really likes to count. And she would like to count, right, an infinite series of the order type of the natural numbers, or else a series of the order type of the negative numbers, doesn't matter to her. She thinks, well, where shall I begin? The number 1 sounds good. So she thinks about that a little bit and quickly sees, for the familiar reason, that we can't start out with 1 and arrive at infinity, because no matter, right, infinity isn't the successor of any number. So she thinks, well, maybe I'll have better luck with the negative numbers. So she thinks, well, maybe if I start out with -1, right, and count backwards, I can pull this off. But then she quickly sees, just as there is no greatest natural number, there is no smallest negative number. Oops, right? Not going to be able to do it this way either. And then it occurs to her, too bad I hadn't just been counting from forever without beginning. Then, every one of the negative numbers, would have had its turn, and I would be done. I'm kind of thinking that she is right, that this possibility has not been closed off. What the symmetry between the two order types shows is that you can't start with 1 and get to infinity, nor can you start with -1 and get to a least natural number. But what it doesn't show is that you can't have done it in the other direction by never having begun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that really is sort of the nub of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like, well, really, in general, in philosophy, when you're presented with some kind of symmetry argument between two different cases, the onus on the detractors is to find some kind of the detractors of the argument, that is to find some kind of relevant difference between the two. And that's really what you're trying to pinpoint, or what you do pinpoint in the paper, is some relevant difference, right? In the case of someone counting up through the natural numbers, it seems as though the reason why she can't do it, it's precisely because infinity, as you pointed out, is not the immediate successor of any of the natural numbers, right? Like that's precisely why she cannot do it. But it's like that consideration doesn't apply in the case of someone having counted down from all the negative integers ending to today. And it just doesn't apply. You don't need to be able to reach some kind of immediate successor and be like, finally I finished, finally I reached infinity, the positive infinity, or something like that. Like, no, instead you just simply have always been counting, and you go back, you counted a smaller number, go back, you counted a smaller number, if we're talking about the negative integers, and so on. So it sounds like you're just pinpointing a relevant difference between the two cases, in which case the symmetry is really not present. There's a relevant difference between them. Is that
it's important to see that there is a symmetry. I
Yeah.
mean, and the symmetry shows that you can't start with -1.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And then count -2, and then count -3, and so on. And in that manner, but then you're just duplicating the same impossible task.
Yeah.
You're starting out with one of them, and it's impossible to get to the end of an endless series. Well, okay, that seems true, but it doesn't follow from that you cannot have gotten to the end of a beginningless series. So the next section of the paper just considers another example of this same fallacious reasoning. It comes from, I'm not sure of the correct pronunciation of his name. I meant to look that up.
I've been told that it's well, I've heard some people say Jacobus, but I've heard from better people that it's like
Jacobus.
Yeah, Jacobus. I've been told that that's a better pronunciation. So
Jacobus Erasmus.
yes, yeah.
Something like that. But anyway, I should have looked that up. But anyway, he has this interesting book on all of this, and he defends the successive addition argument. And he has this charming example in which there's a man named Jones, of course, who has been video recording himself forever. That's the example. And the idea is that if he really could have been video recording himself forever, as Erasmus assures us he could have if time had no beginning, then he should be able to watch the whole video, right? He should be able to watch it in reverse, right? So he should be, if we think of the video as made up of a series of frames, I guess he should be able to start out with the most recent frame and then, going back through the next most recent and then the next most recent after that, get through the whole video. Well, obviously, he's not going to be able to do that. So Erasmus concludes that it's impossible for someone to have been videotaping himself forever. We're not worrying about physics here. We're just talking in the most abstract possible way about possibility. If it's impossible for someone to have been videotaping himself forever, therefore it's impossible for time to lack a beginning. I think I've got that right.
Yeah, no, that is right. And I remember reading that in your paper, and I was kind of mystified by this kind of argument. It's like he basically took the claim that he's trying to demonstrate, namely that if there could be a beginningless series of past events informed by successive addition, then there could be a series that has a beginning but doesn't have an end that is formed by successive addition. But that cannot be the case. So the antecedent is impossible. So you cannot have a beginningless series formed by successive addition. He almost took the claim that he's trying to demonstrate, and then just gave us an example of a case of Jones where he's just saying, oh, well, if Jones can record his whole life here, he should be able to watch it in reverse. Like, that's the very claim you're trying to demonstrate, like whether or not he would be able to watch it in reverse, because that's a series that has a beginning, right? And so he's not going to be able to complete an infinite series if it has that beginning formed by successive addition. But it's like, that's the very claim that you're trying to demonstrate, dude. It's like you dressed it up in this cloak of an example, but you've just asserted it. So I'll turn it over to you. That's what I thought.
That is a good way to put it. I should have made the point your way in my paper too. I mean, he's just given another example of beginning, right, with the beginning of something, and the impossibility of beginning at the beginning of an infinite something, and the impossibility of getting all the way to the end of that same something. He's just given another example of that. But what we need to know is why, if that's impossible, it's impossible to have done it the other way.
Yeah.
My response was to say, well, look, here's what's true. If he has been videotaping himself from forever, right? And he stops taping and he says, well, I'm going to start watching in reverse. Then, yeah, there is a sense in which he can watch the whole video. He can start with the most recent frame and watch backwards and just keep on watching. And in endless time, each frame will eventually be viewed. That doesn't mean that there will be any time at which all of them have been viewed, but each of them will be viewed. That's all that he would be entitled to conclude from from the thought that he's been videotaping himself forever.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it falls apart at that point as well. So I don't think these efforts to, bridge the gap, the logical gap between these two things, are at all successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think I share that assessment. But now we could probably go on to, so we just looked at certain strategies in the literature, which is that first strategy in responding to your point, namely to try to bridge that gap. But now let's move on to the second strategy, where they're just examining the cases individually. So the first one that you consider is in section 5 of your paper, and it's essentially William Lane Craig's arguing that, well, the present simply could not have been arrived. You would have to be like driven back and back. In order to get to this event, you'd first have to get to the one right before it, and then in order to get to that one, you'd first have to get to the one immediately before that, and so on ad infinitum. So it seems like you'd never be able to get to the present.
Never arrive at the present, but here we are in the present. So obviously, a beginningless past is impossible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the argument he gives. I think I probably would be a good idea just to read it out.
That's fine. Yeah.
Exactly what he says.
I like that. I like that.
I have two short paragraphs I'd like to read, and I think they're both important. Here's one. Although the problems will be different, the formation of an actually infinite collection by never beginning and ending at some point seems scarcely less difficult than the formation of such a collection by beginning at some point and never ending. If one cannot count to infinity, how can one count down from infinity? In order for us to have arrived at today, temporal existence has, so to speak, traversed an infinite number of prior events. Okay. Now, the reason I quoted that paragraph is that Craig is talking as if temporal existence, whatever that refers to, right, had a certain task to perform. And we're talking as if that task has been completed. And my error theory about where Craig goes wrong has to do with that picture, the picture of someone standing outside the whole temporal series, trying to, figure out how to complete an infinite series of items. Okay, now Craig clearly wants us to think that it's impossible, right, in its own terms, though, for a beginningless series to have been completed. So he's going to be looking at it separately in its own terms. So here's the argument. But before the present event could occur, the event immediately prior to it would have to occur. And before that event could occur, the event immediately prior to it would have to occur, and so on ad infinitum. One gets driven back and back into the infinite past, making it impossible for any event to occur. Thus, if the series of past events were beginningless, the present event could not have occurred, which is absurd. Okay. Now, I have a couple of things to say about this. One is, what is all this about being driven back and back into the past? There you have the picture of someone who wants to traverse the infinite. He wants to traverse the beginningless past, right? So he's trying to figure out where to begin. It's as if we've just forgotten that we're talking about a series that has no beginning. The traversal of the infinite, in this case, just is each event having happened after the previous one, right? And there being no previous one, there not having been a previous one, right? I don't see how we throw any light on this subject by imagining somebody standing outside, or something, temporal existence as it were, standing outside of time, trying to figure out how to sort of get into time and in such a way as to go through infinitely many ones of the items in the series. So that's my view about where, what's, making him think the way he's thinking about this. But if you leave that aside and you look at this paragraph and you just ask, what exactly is the argument?
Yeah.
The argument is no more than, let me just
Yeah, no,
read.
I have the two things. It's the A to the
Right
B, right?
there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can read this. So you say, if we set aside the misleading picture of someone preparing to traverse an infinite series, and we fix our tenses to reflect the fact that we are talking about the past, then Craig's argument that the present event could not occur amounts to no more than this. A, if the series of past events had no beginning, then before any event in the series could have occurred, the previous event would have had to occur, and before it could have occurred, the one before it would have had to occur, and so on ad infinitum. B, therefore, no event in such a series could ever have occurred, in which case the present event could not have occurred. And I just want to quote you when you say, I wrote on right here, I wrote down like mic drop moment. It's at the end. It's the last paragraph you have in this section. You say regarding this argument, if now we strip out the misleading imagery and stick with what is strictly implied by a beginningless past, we are left with nothing but the fallacious inference of B from A. That is, with the wholly unsupported assertion that no event in a beginningless series of past events could have arrived because infinitely many others would have arrived first. To this, the appropriate response is, yes, that's what a beginningless series of past events would be like, but so what? So I love that. I love that paragraph. That was great. But I'll turn it over to you. Like, yeah, is this, what do you make of this inference from A to B?
I don't really have much to add. I mean, he clearly is trying to describe a necessary condition that he claims can't be satisfied, but he gives no argument for saying that it can't be satisfied. The necessary condition is that each of the preceding events must have occurred. Well, if we're looking at the hypothesis of an infinite series and we're asking, well, what would that be like if there were a beginningless series? Well, this one would have happened, and before it happened, the infinitely many prior events would have happened. And before the next, prior one would have happened, infinitely many, and guess what? They're all past, they all have happened. So what? I mean, necessary condition satisfied. Mm-hmm. Now, our friend Erasmus thinks that I'm begging the question here by assuming that a beginningless series is impossible. No, I'm not begging the question. No. We're both just asking, well, what would a beginningless series be like, right? Here's what it would be like, right? This event would happen before it happened, the infinitely many prior ones, right, would have happened, and so on. That's what an infinite series would be like if one did exist, right? Mm-hmm. I don't see anything going on here in Craig's discussion other than, oh, if that were true, the present could never arise. Well, why?
Yeah.
I mean, why? But that is his go-to argument. Mm-hmm. He's given it over and over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the charge of begging that's interesting, the charge of begging the question. I mean, what we need to, so I'm saying this for the audience, what we need to realize here is that Wes is not here saying, I can show that the past is beginningless, or I know that the past is beginningless, or I know that the past could be beginningless. You're not making those positive claims. You are simply looking at an argument made by Craig and others for the thesis, for the positive thesis that the beginningless past is impossible. And you're saying, you're just offering kind of undercutting defeaters. You're saying, well, hey, you have this premise here, but why should we think that that's true? What argument do you give? And it turns out when you look at this one, it's just an unsupported inference from A to B. And so the onus of justification is not on you here to show that in a beginningless series could be such as to arrive at the present. All you need to do is point out that nothing in Craig's argument shows that the present couldn't arrive.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, from a beginningless series. So I see a lot of Yeah, I see a lot of misunderstandings on the internet, at least in my circles, about the dialectical context. And people who have followed me, they know I'm super big about understanding the dialectic. So because I see it abused so much. But yeah.
For purposes of this discussion, I'm agnostic about whether the past has. Um, uh, yeah, I have trouble conceiving of a time before which there was no time. But I'm not calling that an argument.
Yeah, yeah.
or the that I have some big case to make in favor of beginninglessness.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Okay, well, let's move on to the sixth section where you consider another argument from William Lane Craig, where he's essentially saying like, well, actually, a beginningless past would essentially be like a sufficient condition for someone to be finishing a count at each and every time in that beginningless past, such that at each and every time he would have already been finished, which is kind of like absurd, right? If each and every time you would have already been finished, then you never really even counted at all to begin with, right? You would have already been finished. And so he's basically saying, yeah, the counter, if someone's counting down through all the negative integers up to -1, like he already had enough time to do it, right? He had an infinite past. So like at each point in time, he would have already finished. It's a sufficient condition. So he never actually really counted to begin with, because at each day in the past, he would have already finished by that day. So
well, we just proved that that the present could never arrive, right? If the past had no beginning. Now we're going to prove that if the past had no beginning, the present would always already have arrived. I'm not sure how it works to do both.
These two are a little odd, especially with the counter. It's like, I think you noted this in the paper, but it's like one of them is saying that the counter couldn't have arrived right here, but then the other argument is literally saying that the counter would have already have arrived. Like you can't have them both ways, Craig.
He would always already have completed his count. Yeah. So if the counter had been counting negative numbers forever, he would always already have completed his count. So he can't be completing it at any time. So there can't be any such count. So the counter here stands in for temporal existence, or whatever it is that's supposed to traverse the infinite. So traversing the infinite is impossible. That's roughly how the argument goes. And the flaw in this argument is just really obvious. I mean, what's true is only that at every moment in an infinite count of the negative numbers, infinitely many of them would already have been counted. But what's not true is that all of them would have been counted at every moment. Now Craig knows this. But he keeps on giving this argument. So I don't quite know why he does that. But this is just a complete non sequitur. However, it sort of transitions into another argument.
Yeah, the contrastive explanation one. So yeah, let's get into that.
That takes us beyond the successive addition argument proper. We're still working with the counter example. And Craig's thought here is, well, yeah, I see that doesn't follow, but he'd always, at every time, he'd already had enough time to have completed his count, right? That might not be sufficient for having completed it, but there's no explanation, and there could be no explanation of why he completes it at any given time. And that's a problem. So we now have a whole new argument that this really turns out not, I think, to be the successive addition argument, but it's an argument that spins out of it. So I have a lengthy discussion of it in the paper.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I was just gonna say like, so the argument is essentially saying like, if a beginningless series of these kinds of counting events had been completed today, well then like it would seem inexplicable why it was completed today and not, say, yesterday, given that there was enough time for the counter to be completed yesterday. And so, but yet there has to be at least some kind of partial explanation, at least. This can't be rendered utterly inexplicable. And so, because the beginningless series entails that there could be such an inexplicable event, but we at least need some kind of partial explanation. It follows that beginningless series of this kind cannot occur. So yeah, how about we, what are some of your problems with this?
That's exactly how I understand the argument. Well, the issue that I have with it, or at least one issue I have with it, is that it's not at all clear to me that there couldn't be even a partial explanation, a partial contrastive explanation of why he's finishing when he finishes. I mean, the example doesn't include one, but we can just make up stuff. The whole example is made up. So, we can just make up other crazy stuff. So one thought that I had was that we could imagine, before I get to that, there's a key distinction that I think has to be made. We need to be clear about what exactly Craig is asking for an explanation of. What is it that he's asking us to explain? You might say, well, I can tell you why he's finishing a count of the negative numbers now. He's saying -1, and I can tell you why he's saying -1 now. He's been counting negative numbers forever at the rate of, say, 1 per minute, and he counted -2 1 minute ago. And I can moreover tell you why he said -2 1 minute ago, right? 2 minutes ago, he said -3, and so on. So I can tell you why he's finishing now. I mean, that kind of explanation is obviously not going to satisfy Craig. I think his thought is that if time had no beginning, and there was always already enough time for him to have completed a count at this same rate, one per minute, at any time, then there's no explanation for why the whole count occurs at this series of times, right? The one that ends right here, right now, as opposed to, say, some earlier or some later, right, time. Does that make sense? So it's as if we have two series. One is a series of times, and the other is a series of counting events, right? And we're imagining the case as one in which the series of counting events has gotten all the way through the negative numbers, and it ends at the very final moment of this series of times, which happens to be now. Well, now but here's the thing, the series could, imagine it just the series of counting events slid back a notch, right? So that the final one occurs at t-2, or t-1, or whatever. Yeah. I don't know what my numbering scheme is supposed to be here. But suppose it's just slid back a notch. Well, I think what Craig is asking must be, the only clear thing that I think he could be asking is, why is this whole series of events located at this series of times rather than, right, at a different series of times? And, in raising the question this way, he's of course exploiting, the fact that there's a one-to-one correlation between, -1 and smaller numbers, and -2 and smaller numbers. I mean, there's a one-to-one correlation between them. So if we just slide it back, we're never going to run out of times for these counting events to be occurring at. So why is it that the whole series is completed at this time rather than at some earlier time? That's how I'm understanding his question. I'm just thinking, he says there could be no not even a partial explanation of that. And I just sort of made up a silly one. Imagine that there's another counter and that our first counter keys what he counts at a given time to what that other counter has done, say, I've forgotten what I said in the paper, but 2 seconds earlier or whatever. And that they've both been doing this forever. Well, there's an explanation of why this counter is right. Now, of course, that leaves the question of why the other counters counting events are located at just the times they are. But then we could make up a third counter and so on. I imagine that at this point, most people are going to feel, well, there's some question Craig is trying to ask that you haven't really gotten at yet. I mean, there could be infinitely many counters, and each of the position, the reason each of them is finishing when he's finishing is because some other one is finishing when he or she is finishing, and but why the whole lot of them? Why are their counting events located at just the times at which they are located? And so, what question are we really getting at if we think that's a deep question? And my thought was that maybe it's this. Maybe we're just thinking about the whole history of everything, everything that's ever happened, anything that any gods or angels or demons have ever done, any other universes that may ever have existed, just everything that has ever happened, right? And we're saying, well, that whole, history of everything, it's being completed. I mean, the last element of what I'm calling this history of everything, right? That last element of it is occurring now. But the whole thing could have been completed 1 minute ago or 2 minutes ago. So why now and not 1 minute ago? Why, maybe that's the question Craig is asking. And all I want to say about that is, well, that presupposes a substantival view of time. I mean, you're abstracting time from all of the contents of time, from everything that ever occurs at a time, and you're imagining that there's a distinct temporal series, right, that is ontologically independent of those events, and you're saying that all of those events, right, all of them could have occurred at an earlier sequence of time. And then you're asking, well, why not? And then, since we're talking about everything that's ever happened, it seems like it would be inappropriate for me to be starting to make up stories about infinite counters and who knows what to explain it. So it looks like it would be very hard to come up with any sort of explanation. But this whole way of framing the question, in my opinion, is really presupposes a view of time that Craig himself does not endorse.
Yeah.
In fact, Craig is with Leibniz on this. He holds a relational theory of time. So time just is, right? The flow of time just is the occurrence of events for Craig. And, there is no time apart from the relations amongst events. So really this whole question, the way I framed it, is unintelligible on the view of time that he himself endorses. Now, should we have a substantivalist view of time? Well, that's above my pay grade. But I didn't really take a position on that in the paper. But I do think it's important to see that this whole line of argument that he's pushing presupposes that.
Yeah. No, and it makes perfect sense because you're asking about the whole history of everything. And you're essentially asking if you could like divorce that from the times and then like shift this somehow while keeping the times constant.
Put
But
it
like the,
shifted backwards.
yeah, yeah, but like the whole point of the relational theory of time is like, well, hold on a second. Time is just constituted by the relations within this thing and the different events occurring and the various changes that are happening in here. So it doesn't even make sense to say that you could move this around while, for instance, time is staying still or something like that. You know, it just doesn't really, or that if this stays still and time itself moves, like neither of those make sense. They're unintelligible on the relational view of time, one which Craig himself adopts. And so I thought that was a really interesting point. And if Craig were to take an absolute view of time, well, then it would seem as though our inability to answer why the counting events, say, happened at, you know, this block of the infinite past instead of this block of the infinite past, like our inability to answer that kind of contrastive explanation, it would seem as though that's going to apply to a finite past as well, if God exists, say, right? Like Leibniz pointed this out, and I think you quoted it in your paper. Like, why did God create the universe such that it has a 13.8 billion year old history rather than 14.8 or 12.8 or these other sorts of things? If you could have all the same events, God could just like shift them around in the time span, as it were. And so like Craig would not be able to have an explanation of why God chose one rather than the other. Like, why didn't God do it a millisecond earlier or a microsecond earlier or a nanosecond earlier, you know? Like, and even if he did have some reason or desire to do that, we can still ask, given that God was free to do either one, we can ask, why were some of those reasons and desires effective in one world and not in the other? And you're just going to have no explanation for that. So it seems to me that even if Craig were to go this absolute theory of time route, it's going to pose as just as much of a challenge explanatorily for his view that it does for the history, for the beginningless past. Yeah.
That's a great point. Um, I wonder, I wonder if one could say, well, God just hates empty time, or so so God has a sufficient reason for causing the first event at t=0, or so you've got finite substantivalist time, right? And you've got a finite past, and the reason the very first event in the past occurs at t=0 is, oh, God just hates empty time. They used to say God abhors a vacuum. Well, maybe it's like that.
Yeah, that's really weird though. I mean, like, firstly, they're going to say
Well, you
that,
could go
but
the
that,
other way. God loves empty time.
yeah, exactly. You know, well, listen, they're saying that, but then when we turn to the problem of evil debate, you know, they're going to be like, oh, well, God's motives and his desires and what he hates and what he loves, you know, like, for all we know, God's allowing these sorts of things to, you know, like a fawn dying in the forest fire, like God's allowing that sort of thing to have some kind of great good obtaining. Like, how do we know that empty times wouldn't be such that if God allowed them, certain great goods, like if God waited one more second before the Big Bang, before causing that first event, if he waited one more second, you know, how do we know that some really great good wouldn't have been able to be achieved, or some really bad evil wouldn't have been able to be avoided? Like, it seems as though, given God's infinite cognitive power, it seems as though we can't say it's like metaphysically impossible for God to do that. So I don't know. I wonder. I, Again, all of this, for the audience, all of this is predicated on um, a hypothetical dialectical move that Craig might make, which is to abandon his own relational view of time and accept an absolute view of time.
Oh,
So
well,
yeah,
he's not going to do that.
yeah, well, exactly. I just want the audience to realize that we're not like trying to say, oh, well, even under Craig's view of time, why didn't God create a second earlier? No, like, our point is like, that doesn't make any sense. If we're saying, if, in order to avoid the response that you make to this kind of contrastive explanation argument, if he tries to avoid that by adopting an absolute view of time, then we can run these kinds of arguments against his view. So just orienting the audience there, because I can see people getting kind of mixed up with the trajectory of the discussion. So any kind of final comments on the successive? I know we just got through the substantive sections of the paper. So any final comments on the successive addition argument before we close it out?
Well, this is what I said in the conclusion to the paper, but I really think that the key thing to understand is that the traversing of the infinite isn't, somebody or something temporal existence, as it were, having to find a foothold, right, in time, and then, somehow cross over an infinite series of temporal intervals. That's not what traversing the infinite is. Traversing the infinite is just infinitely many things having happened, one after another. That's all it is. It's not that there's something that has to do this impossible task, right? I don't know if it's possible that the past has no beginning and infinitely many events have happened one after another. I don't claim to know the answer to that, but I do know, I think I know, that this argument doesn't settle the question. So that's where I'd leave it.
Yeah, and it was such an excellent paper. Thank you for publishing it, and thank you for coming on my channel to discuss it. This was really
Thanks
fun.
for the invitation.
Yeah, and I hope the audience learned something during this. Oftentimes, more popular discussions on the Kalam don't really, they kind of just leave the successive edition argument off on the side. I know Craig talks about it, but I haven't really seen it too much on the YouTube scene, but maybe we'll enliven something here with our discussion.
Maybe one other thing for your audience. It's important to understand that this argument is completely distinct from all the arguments about the impossibility of an actual infinite.
Yes.
The successive addition argument is a completely separate argument.
Yes.
It doesn't say that the actual infinite is impossible, right, in general. It doesn't say that a Hilbert's Hotel, for example, is impossible. I mean, for all this argument says there could be, right, there could be an infinity of coexistent items. What this argument says is that even if there could be an actual infinite of some kind, here's one kind of actual infinite there could not be, namely one that is formed by successive addition. And it's this specific argument that I'm going after here. So that's just a footnote.
Yeah, no, it's good. So yeah, everyone, if you made it to this point in the video, you probably see value in the work that I do. So consider becoming a patron or making a one-time donation. Much love to all my patrons and all you guys that help. So thank you very much. And again, check links in the description. And what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.